smidge if you're liable to nod off, which we don't imagine will happen. The first item is that all of Joan's 3 books are available at the bookstore and will be available for sale and signing afterwards if you didn't already take the opportunity. And I understand that you have a new book coming out soon, this fall? Okay, so there's more goodies coming. We don't have it yet, not published, but there's more. The second announcement is, you know, I usually like to give a foretaste of what's coming in our first Monday lecture in June. This time I'm going to have to say that it will be a surprise brought to us by our young adult friends whose conference, Continuing Revolution, coincides with our first Monday in June, June 5. And so it will be a surprise. You can keep your eyes peeled on our website to find out who that special mystery guest speaker will be. Last year's was a particularly exciting young woman from Baltimore involved with Black Lives Matter. So I'm expecting it will be somebody that will be energetic and challenging, provocative, and very good for all of us to hear from. So keep your eyes peeled for June 5. This evening, it's my pleasure to introduce our groundskeeper who has been maintaining not our old growth forest, but there are some very old trees here, as many of you know. Certainly our Championship Beach was here originally, and although its surrounding companions in that forest may not be old growth, it certainly is. And Lloyd has maintained our arboretum with over 144 wooded species on our 23-acre plot, has maintained our perimeter path trail for the enjoyment of those nature lovers, staff, sojourners, and visitors to witness the various parts of our topography, including the pond, our pine forests, through our garden, and through the various plantings that have been made over the years of rare species as well as those that are indigenous to our part of the country. Lloyd is, I think, the longest serving, continuously serving staff member in the history of Pendle Hill for 87 years now. So please give a warm welcome to someone we'd often see in the front of the podium to introduce Joan Maloof. Lloyd Gwindon.
Thanks, John. One moment. I first learned of Joan Maloof 10 years ago when I stumbled across her book, Teaching the Trees, Lessons from the Forest. Her writing in this collection of essays was an engaging combination of other heroes from my bookshelf. She wrote with the depth and plant knowledge of Michael Durr, the depth of feeling of Mary Oliver, and conscience of Rachel Carson. I loved this book and shared it with all my tree-loving friends. She had become my new rock star. Time passed. Highlights from her book wove their way into my occasional tours of our property with visitors, but the book got buried back on my shelf with Durr and Carson and other ecological authors. I went back to my Pendle Hill routine, weeding and praying, pruning and pot washing. A year ago in this room, we were having our daily introductions of guests following meeting for worship. A stranger to me stood up, said she and her family would be leaving shortly after a nice weekend together, and introduced herself as Joan Maloof. Joan Maloof, I thought to myself with my 50-something-year-old brain. That name sounds familiar. Joan Maloof, Joan Maloof. I should know this person. But the dots didn't connect, and I was too shy and embarrassed to ask her who she was. Our period of announcements ended, and we went our separate ways out of the building. I headed to the maintenance shop with a colleague, and 20 steps out the door, it hit me, Joan Maloof! Professor Emeritus of Environmental Science and Biology at Salisbury University in Maryland, and author of Teaching the Trees, Lessons from the Forest. Joan Maloof, author of a second book titled Among the Ancients, Adventures in the Eastern Old-Growth Forest. Joan Maloof, author of the recently published book, Nature's Temples, The Complex World of Old-Growth Forests. I ran home to find her book for an autograph. I hustled to the parking lot to introduce myself, but it was not to be on that day. We were unable to connect, but tonight I brought my pen. Joan's work as a scientist, an author, and a teacher has grown into a new calling as the founder and director of Old Growth Forest Network, a young organization taking steps to save our old growth forests for future generations. Tonight, we will learn about this important work. Join me in gratitude and warm welcome for Joan Maloof.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted to share my story of finding Pendle Hill, since you shared your story. It was in the 80s, and some of my mentors in peacemaking, Philip Bosserman and the Berrigans, would come to Pendle Hill on their yearly sojourns, and it was a mythical place for me, this Pendle Hill. Pendle Hill. And then when my first book came out, Teaching the Trees, I got one of the early emails I got from a reader was from a woman who was staying here, working here at that time. I wish I could remember her name, but I don't. And she said, you should come to Pendle Hill. We have many beautiful trees and a wonderful campus, and you should come and give a talk here. And that was in 2005. So a dozen years later, here I am. And what happened when my siblings and I were searching for a place where we could spend some time together, I said, Pendle Hill, because I'd always wanted to see this place, and I hadn't been here, and we got here, and it was perfect, and the grounds were so lovely, and we always stroll the whole perimeter trail, and I admire each tree, and when I come back here, I have to see my old friends. You can ask my sisters, right? So this is so wonderful. Thank you. So that's how we're all here tonight, and I have some more of my family here with me tonight also, so welcome to them. So we're going to start with this talk tonight with a little bit of reality check, which sometimes can be a little bit of a downer, right? But so the whole thing's not going to stay that way. I just wanted to center ourselves in where we are now on the earth. And this is that reality, and it is, yes, the top part here, the original forest cover, and what they mean by original, I think that's about 5,000 years ago, before trees were traded as a commodity. And with the dawn of civilization and the invention of money and things, trees began to be traded and cut, and now, well, this needs to come up to date, but today we only have 30% of the landmass covered in forests. So from 46% down to 30%. And that change is all due to human action. And we continue to lose forest cover every year. We have not stopped the bleeding, so to speak. The statistics come out every 5 years from the United Nations, Food and Agriculture Administration, and they tell us how much more forest cover we have lost. So, for example, globally from 1990 to 2015, we lost another 314 million acres of forest. So we all know how important the forests are for ourselves and for the other living creatures, but yet still somehow we don't seem to be able to stop the clearing. And it's not just how much forest, it's also what kind of forest, because a lot of this 30% coverage that's left is forest that's been greatly manipulated by humans. A lot of it is pine plantation, or a lot of it is very young forest. I became very interested in our original forests. You can think of the forest as an organism of their own that covers this skin of the earth. What were they like? How much of them are left? How do they function? And that became a great interest of mine. And in my first book, I wrote about visiting one of these old growth forests that had never been logged. And I wrote about what it was like to breathe that air. And so many people became interested in where that forest was because they wanted to have this experience too, that I ended up writing a second book about old growth forests. That's Among the Ancients, and visiting these old growth forests. So this, I'm going to show you 3 slides, were part of the research from doing that book, Among the Ancients. This image was made in 1925 by the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, Greeley. And so he said, okay, in 1620, so we're talking about, you know, at the beginning of European settlement in what was to become the United States, that black area is what they're calling the virgin forest. The white areas could not support forest growth. Those are our prairies and our deserts, but all the black supported forest growth. Now, there were already human beings living here at that time, cultures and communities of native people, and they had certainly cleared some forests, both for wood to stay warm and for their buildings and to clear for their gardens, but the majority of the landscape, the vast majority of the landscape, was still this original forest. So I'm using a couple names. They use virgin here. It's kind of an outdated term. Now we'll use a term like old growth forest or original forest or primary forest. So with European settlement came the clearing of this original forest. So by 1850, you can see how much of it was gone. And the coastal plain areas where there were a lot of longleaf pines, they were very easy to get out. It was flat. Anywhere near the waterways, that timber was taken. The mountains, you can see the Appalachian Mountains, it was a little more difficult to get the timber out of there. And a lot of this timber was exported to the nations that had already stripped their forests. So when the Pilgrims landed, they were told, as soon as you get off the Mayflower, we want you to fill it up with logs and send it back. So already, vast exports of forest, and a lot of it used internally too. All those railroad tracks, the train trestles, all the buildings, just clearing for farm fields. A lot of the old growth was just cut and burned where it lay, and Henry David Thoreau writes about that. And as technology increased, the speed with which they could cut increased too, and the trains could get to places. So by 1920, this is what was left of the old growth, and by then, you see we had gotten to the western states, the western frontier, and started clearing. Again, this is made in 1925, and we don't really have a newer image. We kind have lost the sense of how much old growth was left. We know that the cutting continued every decade. More and more of the old growth forest was lost. Some of you may know of an old growth forest that was lost in your lifetime, cut. And it wasn't until 1992 when a woman named Mary Bird Davis finished a survey where she called every state and talked to every person most knowledgeable in the state, DNR and the wildlife people and the heritage people and the Nature Conservancy people, and said, is there any old growth left in your state? Where is it and how much is it? And she put together this survey and found that less than 1% remained in the east. So we have very little original forest left. So for Among the Ancients, I decided that I would visit one of each of these old growth forests in the 26 eastern states and tell people exactly how to get there and what I found there and make the case for these old growth forests. And I wanted to do this in the east because so often we know about the old growth forests in the west. You know, a lot of us, raise your hand if you've ever been to like the redwoods or sequoias or anything. Yeah. So we know that, oh, the old growth is out there, but where's the old growth here? It's like there was no good resource for that. So I thought a resource that could at least let us know that even though these places are rare, they do exist, and we can go see them and understand what our planet can produce here. What was right here in this spot? Can we imagine what was right here where I'm in this room? What occupied it? What it looked like? So for that book, I was, and again, just trying to figure out where these places are. That survey didn't give directions. It didn't have addresses. And I didn't do it all at once. I did them kind of in chunks over a couple years. And as I was driving from one to another, I just was astounded by how little was left and how far apart they were. It really hit home on those journeys. And I thought, really? We were that efficient at clearing these forests? And how is the average child ever even going to get to see what our forests look like? And if they don't get to see one, if we don't get to see one, how can we build a relationship with it? How can we understand? How can we defend the forests that are left? This is Elder Leopold. Says we can only be ethical in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or have faith in. So what does it mean when we have a generation of people that don't understand what the earth can produce? How are they going to be ethical in relation to it? How are they going to defend it if they're just spending time in front of the computer screen? And that brought me to the question of what to do. It's really easy to say, oh, if only they had left some. I had a little bit of that. I mean, can you imagine how amazing it would be if we had 100 acres of old growth forest down the road from here? Can you imagine how many people would come to see that? How many people would want to be supporters and stewards of that place? How many people would... So there is the if only, but then you go from that to, well, what next? Because now it's our turn, right? Every generation we've lost more forests and we've lost old growth forests. So if it happens on our watch, it's our fault. It's up to us. So what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? So what can we do? And not just for humans either. There are other living things that we're losing along with those forests. And this is a graph of the Living Planet Index produced by the World Wildlife Fund. So what they did was they said, we want to try to measure biodiversity on the planet. We want to kind of take its temperature. How do we do that? How do we give biodiversity a number? That was a tough task. So what they did, they said, okay, we've got to start somewhere. So we'll call 1970 baseline. We'll call that 1. Now, some of you, like me, were around in 1970, and you know that already we disturbed a lot by then. But they just had to start somewhere with baseline. And then what they do is they surveyed these scientists that were studying these different organisms, and every year they would check in with them and say, how's your organism doing? Whether it's penguins or polychaetes. They'd say, how's your organism doing this year in your studies? Do you have more of them? Do you have less of them? How are they doing? And the scientists would report back, and you can see that the Living Planet Index does not have good news for us. We are losing biodiversity on this planet, and that, of course, goes hand in hand with the loss of forests, because 2/3 of the terrestrial organisms depend on the forested ecosystem. So we're losing these creatures, both species and population numbers, and that's our biodiversity, and we depend on this in ways that we don't even understand yet. So this is like playing Jenga. Which little piece is going to cause things to come crashing down? And we only have one of these, right? Just a reminder. I think we need to be reminded more. Another Aldo Leopold quote: if we are serious about restoring ecosystem health and ecological integrity, then we must first know what the land was like to begin with. So we've got to be able to understand these places so we can even use them as controls or use to measure against what we have now. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to know what the land is like? How are we going to restore these pieces? How are we going to connect young people, all people, with what our land can do? So that question and what came to me in my journeys was, we're going to have to form an organization that can do this. I certainly can't do it alone. And that organization, you know, it's easy to just say, save the forest, but we've got to make it real. We've got to make it measurable. And so then it came to me, what about one forest in each county, protected from logging and open to the public? Then no person would be very far from one of these forests that certainly, most likely, was not to be untouched now. You know, maybe was something that had been cut and is regrown. Maybe we'll have to wait another 100 or 200 years for it to really have old growth characteristics, but at least it won't be cut again. It'll be protected from logging and open to the public. We can develop a relationship with it, and we can see it. So, you know, that idea was just kind of like, yes, that's what we have to do. The old growth forest network, a network of these forests. No matter where you move, no matter where you go, you can always look up, what's the closest forest to me that's going to remain unlogged? And I had no idea how many counties there were. And I Googled it. It's like, oh my goodness. So remember that first graph with the black? You know, here it's shown in pink and green. Those are different forest types. The white is where forests can't grow. So not every county can support forest growth, but approximately 2,370 of them can. So that's the mission of the Old Growth Forest Network. One forest in each of these counties, protected from logging, open to the public, so we can see and build a relationship. So a little closer to home, let's look at Pennsylvania. So there are the counties of Pennsylvania, right? Where do we start? Even just one state, that's a big job. And we have a very small staff, the Old Growth Forest Network. We started 4 years ago, and the staff, I'm the only full-time staff person. I do have an assistant. So what we do is get a volunteer for a county. So each county has, we call them a county coordinator, if somebody's interested, and they volunteer to look around their county and see if they can find any old growth forests, forests that are protected. And so far in Pennsylvania, we have lots of volunteers. I'm very happy to say. So this is, these are just the counties A through F here on the left. And on the right, we have the names of our volunteers, our county coordinators who are looking around in that county. And here's counties L through W. So if you see a county you're interested in that doesn't have a county coordinator, and it doesn't have to be Pennsylvania either. A lot of people have second homes in a place and they want to look around there, or they know a forest there. So if you want to help us out, you can fill out this card I have on the book table out there and just write. There's a line here, it says, what county do you live in? A lot of people read that and their mind thinks country, but we're asking about the county. And if you're willing to be a county coordinator, you can just write that on there. So what does a county coordinator do? Well, we have a little job description we send them, and basically we are asking them to look for forests that are as mature and native as possible. So is there any old growth left in your county? And this can be fun for people to just start asking around and like, who knows the most about the forests in this county? And then you're told to call this person and talk to that person and just have conversations about forests. It's really fun. And then the next part is doubly fun because then you get to go visit them and then ask the question, is this forest protected from logging? And it's really interesting because a lot of forests that everybody assumes are protected from logging are not. Even the state parks. Only 8 states have protected their state parks. I'm not sure the status of Pennsylvania. So if somebody wants to, they're not protected here either. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is one place where we can help sometimes, where a particular forest may want to be in the old growth forest network, but then we look and see, well, you don't have strong enough protection. So sometimes we can actually encourage stronger protection on a particular forest. And the forests have to be open to the public, remember, and relatively accessible. So the fun good news is that the very first forest in the old growth forest network was a Pennsylvania forest. And that was dedicated in April 2012, so I guess we've been doing it 5 years now. And that was in Cook Forest, Pennsylvania. How many of you have been to Cook Forest? Okay, wow, that's amazing. Well, in this book, I give exact directions, and I talk about going to Cook Forest. It's in the western part of the state, 2/3 of the way west, about 2/3 of the way down from north to south. And it is one of our national treasures as far as eastern old growth forests. It's very large, over 1,000 acres of original unlogged forest. And I would encourage you to go there if you really want to see what the eastern forests look like. These are all the Pennsylvania forests that have been dedicated into the old growth forest network so far. And Pennsylvania is leading the pack with Ohio. You guys are tied neck and neck, see? So you got to help get ahead of Ohio here. It's amazing. The Pennsylvania people love their forests. And the old growth forest network now includes 65 forests in 17 different states. So we're doing pretty well. So what is the status of old growth in Pennsylvania? Well, remember that 1%? You guys might be a little higher than that, but still, this state would have been 95% forested. The only places wouldn't have forest would be where it was too wet or too rocky, maybe at the top of some peaks, things like that. Everything else would have been forest, beautiful forest. The only old growth left is the dark green there, little dark green sprinkled around where probably very rocky areas, hills. But the state forest has proposed expanding those areas. So the light green are the areas where they planned not to cut. Now, this was a while ago, so I'm not sure how they're doing with that. We need to pay attention to that and look at it. But the other fun thing about Pennsylvania is it is the only state that has an old growth forest driving tour. And this, if you're really interested in this, I would say write down this web link, because it can be really difficult to find again. It's kind of buried in there. So DCNR, you could get to the DCNR page and then Forestry Old Growth Forest Index. Forests that are already in the network that you want to find out where they are, you can visit our web page, oldgrowthforest.net, and under forests you can look under dedicated forests and then by state and then by county, and we give you exact directions to how to get there. And notice donate button, Facebook page, all those things. You can volunteer for help. You can to help us. You can register to be a county coordinator. So that's basically the Forest Network, but then we saw that our work was a little bit bigger than that, because in addition to creating this network, there were, as I gave talks and talked to people, I realized that there are a lot of people that own forest land that don't really know what to do with it. They have questions about it. And so often they're told to call in a forester, or they're required to have a forester examine their land because they want to have reduced property tax rates. So to be in, if you're considered like agricultural or forestry, state by state it varies, but you can get lower tax rates. So the foresters will come in frequently and recommend that a forest be thinned or logged, especially if it's species like beech that aren't very valuable in the marketplace. And in Maryland, where I live, they would recommend that those forests be taken down and pine trees be planted instead, because they grow quickly and they can be sold for timber. So we started looking at the private forests, and then we also saw that there were private forest owners that had made the commitment to protect their forests, and they'd foregone that income. And we wanted to encourage them, so we created the private forest network to celebrate those people who have chosen to put their land not just in conservation easement, but because most of the conservation easements do allow logging, but in a forever wild type conservation easement, which does not allow logging. And so then there are the people that have formally protected their forests, and then there are people that have just said, you know what, I'm never going to log this forest. I don't want to put it in the easement, but it's my commitment to never log this forest. And we shake their hand and say, okay, you get to be in the private forest network too. So you can see those people listed on the website, and anybody can register themselves. So often people are told that forests have to be managed to be healthy. You hear this over and over again. You read it, oh, sustainable harvesting, forests need to be managed to be healthy. But what does that even mean? What does that mean? What do they mean by healthy? You know, it's just this vague term. It's like freedom, you know. Yes, we want freedom. What does that mean? What does that look like? And so in these old growth forests, I want to say the trees were taller and bigger, and there were more species, and that looked healthier to me than the managed forests I saw. So that's what inspired me to write this book, Nature's Temples, which my name for it was my science book. Because what I was doing was just drop it into the scientific literature and reading any studies where any scientist had compared an unmanaged forest to a managed forest. And by managed, I mean thinned or logged. So the forests that are totally left alone versus the forests that had some forestry type management. And so I'm going to quickly go through what I found in those studies. The first one is my own study. And this was done because as I visited the forest for Among the Ancients, I would, as a scientist, I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to see all these forests. Remember that, scientific method and observation. I'm going to observe all these forests, and what am I going to find? What new pattern will I discover? What paper can I write for this new pattern? And over again, I came out of the forest and was like, okay, what did I observe? I'd say, wow, that is so beautiful. That forest was so beautiful. And I started thinking, maybe we can measure that. And so at the time I was still teaching, and there were hundreds of biology students, and I could not bring them to an old growth forest because there wasn't one closest to us. But I brought them to forests of various ages, and it was one of these blind studies. They didn't know what we were testing and why, but the mature forest did come out to be statistically more beautiful than the younger forests. So I believe that this would hold even greater for the old growth forests. And so studies to do with carbon. We used to think that the younger forests that were more actively growing sequestered more carbon. We now know that that is not the truth. That the older a forest is, the more carbon it sequesters. And that if you log a forest, you're going to set back that carbon sequestration. So the green line is an unlogged forest. The blue and red are logging at various forest intervals. And one of the reasons we used to think the young forest grew faster and sequestered more carbon is because we were only looking at the rings, the width of the rings. And I say we, most of this research was done in forestry schools, right? And they'd see these wide growth rings, annual rings. And then as the trees got older, those rings would get narrower and narrower and narrower, and they thought, oh, it's slowing down its growth. But think about it, that ring might be narrower, but look at this massive tree that it's covering. That beech tree out there, it's old, it's starting to be on its way out, but it's still putting on new wood. And when it puts on that skin, it's putting the skin on a massive surface. So those large trees can gain the weight of a full average sized tree in 1 year if you put all of that surface area together. And the old trees are putting carbon in the ground, too, through their roots. So the unmanaged forests sequestered more carbon. And the unmanaged forests also are important for their water holding capacities, their water transpiring capacities, because there's more leaf mass there. They're putting more water into the atmosphere, and they're holding more water in the soils, and even in things like the trunks of the coarse woody debris is holding moisture. And that water that's held in the forest is so important for so many different organisms. Like this little, anybody know what this is? It's a salamander, a nymph of a salamander, spotted salamander. And those things sticking up are its gills, and it's getting oxygen from the water through those external gills. And when that gets older and that vernal pool dries up, they're going to shrink down, and then the salamander will become a land creature. And that salamander will live its whole life within an 8-foot area. And it can see very well and smell very well and taste very well and hear very well. And, if any heavy machinery comes through there, it can totally disrupt the life of the salamander. And there are many creatures like that out there in the native forests that are more abundant in the old growth forest. I'm sorry, this is hard to see here, but this was a study done on redback salamander numbers. In the clear cut, there were 0 per acre, the second growth 96 per acre, and the old growth 488 per acre. And the salamander has no lungs. It has no gills. The adult, it's getting oxygen through its skin that has to stay damp. So that dampness exists in the older forest. Now, plant diversity, our wildflowers, much higher in the unmanaged old growth forest. In fact, often people, when a forest is cut, we're told, oh, it'll recover, it'll grow back. But when you look at wildflower diversity, we have never seen a case where it's fully recovered from logging operations, even after 100, 150 years. Don't worry about the Latin names over here. What we're looking at is on the left side of this graph, numbers from an old growth forest. On the right side, numbers from a second growth forest. Second growth means a forest that's been logged and grown back. And all you have to do is look at these black bars, even if you can't see very well. You can see that there's a lot more of them, a lot more of these plant species in the old growth than in the second growth. There are moss species that are only found in older forests because the bark is thicker on those trees and it can hold more moisture some of those species need. Oops. That's just a picture of moss. Some insect species are only found in older forests, only found in older forests. That means if our older forests are cut down, disappear, those species will disappear with it. And the coarse woody debris is the reason why these older forests are important to so many things, like the moss and the fungi I'll get to, and the insects, because there are so many organisms that depend on this thick, dead material. The fungi are living in there, and then they're eaten by the insects, and the insects are eaten by the amphibians and the reptiles, and the mammals eat them, and this is really, and they're returning those nutrients that tree stored in it over its lifetime back to the ground. And the temperatures are more stable in this large dead wood than in small dead wood that comes from the younger forests. So this is hugely important part of the forest ecosystem. And there are many bird species that do better in the older forest too. They need the little cavities from the trees that are breaking off and falling apart. Again, back to our beech tree. You know, I was out there today looking at it, and I was, you know, seeing where it's struggling, because we all do when we get to be 150 years old as humans, and little pockets. And I was thinking, you know, I wonder what's living up there. And the little birds, the bats. Bats are more abundant in old growth forests. Warblers that come through on migration, much more commonly found in the old growth forests. Fungi species, more species in an older forest. And we are just now learning more about this too. Like when you think about the things we're learning in these last few years, think of what more we're going to learn. You know, we're just learning really about how the mycelia from the fungi connect to the roots of the trees, and the mycelia from the fungi give the trees water and nutrients, because those fungi can dissolve rock. You know, they can dissolve things tree roots can't dissolve and deliver those minerals and nutrients to the tree. And the tree, meanwhile, it's got its leaves way up there, and it's making sugar from that sunlight. And that's something the fungi can't do. So the tree's sharing that with the fungi so they can have the energy to grow and form their fruiting bodies, their mushrooms that are going to create spores for the next generation. So many more species in old growth. And we are also just learning that these roots and these fungi are in community with each other. And they are sharing not just one root and one fungus, but many different trees are sharing with many different fungi. These are Douglas fir trees from British Columbia. This is like Suzanne Simard's data here from her lab. And the dark green are the larger, older Doug firs, medium green, medium, light green, the young ones. And what they found, the black lines are the fungal, so not, you know, the direct connection, symbolic connections of the fungi with the trees. So for instance, this tree right here, one of the bigger, older trees, is connected by its fungal network to 47 other trees. So one tree can experience something, share that information with the others. And this fungal network consists of 11 different individual fungi genetics, 2 species, 9 individuals of one and 2 of the other. So you know, we can't just walk through a forest anymore and look and say, oh, I think we should take that tree, and think it's not going to affect the rest of the forest, because everything in there is connected and communicates. Even little tiny lichen species, much more abundant in the old growth forest. Snails, and we tend not to even think of them. It was not until just 2 years ago that a master in Kentucky said, you know what, I'm going to look at the snails in the old growth forest versus the younger forest. And he collected 3,000 snails, 70 different species. I mean, I can't identify even 5 different species of snails. I don't know if anybody in here can identify more than that, but 70 different species. 20 of those species he found only in the old growth forest. So it's obvious we need to preserve these unlogged forests and build a people of community who care. Build a community of people who care about them, because we can't just save the forests, because the people are going to have to protect those forests. We also need people to care about them, and we're part of the community too, right? Just kind of like that fungal network, and we can appreciate their beauty and appreciate them, and they even sense us, even the trees. I mean, many of the organisms sense us as they walk through there. And so this is the first time I've showed a slide of this. This is my next book that is just at the press, and this is the coffee table book. And I did this with a photographer, Robert Llewellyn, who's in Virginia. And it's really just you know, a celebration of that beauty and the biodiversity, and to just help people say, wow, you know, wow, yes, we got to keep this standing. So I hope you'll be part of that community, because as I said, we're not just a network of forests, we're a network of people who care about forests. So if you want to stay connected like the fungal roots, you can fill out the card and stay connected with us. Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. We'll have some time for questions. As you know, this is being live streamed thanks to Julian Gwendon. And if you have questions, if you would raise your hand and be recognized, I'll come by with a microphone and put it right about here, right under your lower lip, and you'll be fine. Don't have to shout or just speak normally. But keep it there so we can all hear it, and the people who are viewing this at a distance can hear your questions as well as Joan's answers. So I'll start things off because I already have the microphone. My question is, how big do you have to be to qualify as a forest? What makes a forest a forest and not, say, a woods or something?
Mm-hmm. Well, the term woods and forest are used interchangeably. I prefer forest because woods to me sounds like the product that people would want to take out of it. To me, a forest feels like more of all the things that live in there, so it's not a huge distinction. And there is not really any minimum size to be called a forest, so what we know as ecologists is the bigger the better. The larger your forest is, the more different species you're going to have in there. So when you start to say, well, we'll only cut half of it, then you're going to automatically lose biodiversity there. It's just a principle of conservation biology. Now, for the old growth forest network, the smallest forest that I'm considering right now, and this isn't a line that I've drawn in the sand, but this is just an actual forest, it's 14 acres. And the reason that feels very small to me, I mean, it certainly cannot have all the biodiversity of a larger forest, but that small forest is a true old-growth forest. And it has a wonderful trail through it and accessibility and all the things we like and big old trees. So I'm trying to get that in the old growth forest network, but it's managed by the Maryland State Park System and it is not protected from logging. So we're still working on that one. So thanks.
What does the, if you have a small forest and you have an area that you try to preserve around it, like you were talking about and showed in one of the slides with the light green areas, what's the interaction between the two? How does the new area, will it eventually turn into an old growth forest, or how does it support the old growth part that it's in the middle of it?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So let's say we have the core of a forest, then around it a younger forest. We call that a buffer. And the buffer is very important for a lot of reasons. One, the reason I just said, the larger a forest is, the more species you're going to have. So you're increasing the size of the forest because, yes, that buffer will get older and older, and you will have a larger, older forest eventually. Ideally, you could keep adding buffers on the outside. The buffer also will do things like slow the encroachment of invasive species. So if you have a true old growth forest like Cook Forest I talked about that's huge, you walk in there, you walk to the center of that, you're not going to find any invasive species. But the smaller and smaller that forest gets, the more edge it has, the easier it is for the light and those species to get in there. The other reason a buffer is really important is for humidity. So it's like it's like putting on a sweater for that forest, and it will keep it from drying out, and it also protects from wind. Because I've seen so often people say, okay, well, we're only going to cut from here over and we're going to save the big trees. Well, if those big trees are exposed to wind and air, they're going to dry out, they're going to be blown over, and your forest is going to get smaller. So you're protecting your forest by having that buffer around it. It's healthy. Yeah. And now,
I think it's me.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
When I was a kid, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and whenever I would turn over a rock or a log, I would find salamanders. And now when I take my students out into similar forests, I tend not to find the salamanders. And what I heard about 15 years ago is that this is attributed to earthworms, which I thought were native but are not. And apparently they aerate the soil so much that the soil dries out. And I'm just curious if you can give any other information about that.
Well, thank you for your question. And it's kind of like a commercial because I just happen to have a chapter about that in my new book, Nature's Temples. and the title of that chapter is Worms, Friend or Foe. And so I started out by telling how I always thought worms were so good for the soil, and they would turn it over and they would aerate it and put the organic matter in there. Well, another thing that we're really just learning about is that so many of these worms are non-native worms, and what happens is that they devour that detritus, the leaves and the twigs and everything on the forest floor, so that instead of having this layer of dead leaves that's decomposing into soil and protecting the soil layer and keeping it damp and being a great place for wildflower seeds to germinate, what's happening is the worms are chewing all that up, they're taking it underground, and then what you have in places is bare soil where those seeds cannot survive. They do dry out too quickly, and so the worms are reducing the biodiversity of the forest. Now, how that ties into the salamanders, I have not read any scientific papers on that. I'm not saying there aren't any, I just haven't read them, but I would say you're right, just like the wildflower seeds, because that moist, damp layer does not exist, the salamanders cannot be there. They cannot breathe because they need dampness to exchange oxygen through their skin. So interesting observation. Thank you. He had a question too after. Yeah.
Did you have a question? I'll get to you next because I didn't see a hand there, I'm afraid.
That's okay. You can go ahead.
So, I love your books on old growth forests, but also as a young person entering from a very different angle, I've been a part of different tree plantings where I'd go to a natural area and we would have, hundreds of trees or, maybe 1,500. And they would be all different native species, and a bunch of them would be pot bound, and there would be someone who took an auger and dug a hole, every 10 feet and planted them in rows. And it seems to me like the success of trying to make forests that would be long-lasting, because of not knowing that trees that are pot-bound will, choke themselves out, and not realizing that rows of trees are not naturalistic in structure. It bothers me. Like I want to help with preserving the old growth forests, but to establish or reestablish forests. Is there an avenue that you would recommend to get information out to people, not just about like through the Old Growth Forest Network, but encouraging organizations to like do the background research and or any avenue of policy or avenue of advertisement that could be used to facilitate properly planting new forests so that they don't die out immediately and so that they are there to be protected and to grow eventually, 300 years from now into beautiful forests that people can visit.
Thank you for your question. The poet W.S. Merwin, if any of you have ever heard of him, he says, only a forest can plant a forest. And I do believe there's truth in that. I think when we start thinking we can design and create a forest, that what we can come up with, the best we can do, is going to be a very poor imitation. Because even those pot-bound trees, where did that genetic material come from? Where are those, even if they're a species like black gum that's native here, it's like, well, is that a black gum from, Missouri? Is that a black gum from Massachusetts? Is it, I think we'd be better served by putting our effort into preserving the forests that we have, or even preserving the space for a forest to come back from its own seed stock. And it's interesting to me because so often I see these, I'll look up grants. Oh, there's a grant for forests, and I'm looking, and almost all of them are for planting trees, and money to plant trees, and they have young people planting trees. Meanwhile, the forest that's perfectly good, better than anything that planted forest is going to be, is being cut down across town. So I think our energy would be better put into forest preservation than to forest restoration as far as planting. That's where I see my work, my play. So thank you.
Joan, some of the root that we have of our problems, industry, real estate, of course, I have one daughter here, it's in the real estate, but I'm talking about disregard of the really mature trees, parks, it could be parks, and without any regard, if the county wants something taken down because they're going to put offices or whatever the reason would be, that's part of the problem. It's to save some of what we have. I'm talking about a couple of trees that are maybe 200 or 300 years old.
Yes,
You just cut them down.
Right.
So
yes, so that's Really important. It's a little bit different than the forests I'm talking about protecting, but the trees and the urban tree canopy especially. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's so important to retain for the air quality, for the water quality. So how do we retain the urban tree canopy? And one place to start is to make sure every community has a tree ordinance. And that means somebody can't just buy that house on the corner that's always been surrounded by beautiful, huge oak trees and decide, you know what, I'm tired of raking leaves, and I'm going to cut all those trees down. And the next year, they're like, you know what, I'm tired of living in this town, and I'm going to move to the next town. Meanwhile, look at that treasure that they've removed and have been allowed to remove. But if there's a tree ordinance, it could help a little bit to control that. And I've talked to people all over that are trying to create strong tree ordinances. In fact, that's one thing we'd like to do with the Old Growth Forest Network, is help share with people how to create one and how to make it strong. So I would say in each community, wherever you live, it would be nice if each of you could just find out, is there a tree ordinance in your community? If there's not, maybe get one started. The other thing with development, and I see this happening a lot, there's going to be, you know, like you mentioned the county, a new school or a new road or a new library or a new nursing home. Oh, where are we going to put that? Or a new development if you're a developer. And they roll out the maps, and what they're looking at is the green spaces because they think there's nothing there. You know, oh, we'll put the road over here because there's nothing there. We'll put the school over here and this green spot, there's nothing there. Well, there's likely a forest there or beautiful trees. So we need to reverse that. We need to have them be looking instead at the white places that were developed but maybe not to their best potential. And say, well, let's put the road over here. Let's put the school over here where this old, you know, thing was. Let's not go for the green spaces. So and that's going to have to be planning and zoning. It's going to have to be at the municipal level. So how do we get them to change? It's either going to be pressure from citizens who care. And I just came from Atlanta where that's happening. Very inspirational. 300 people were at the talk saying, we can't lose any more of our urban tree canopy. Or it can be from people who care getting in positions of power and changing it. In Worcester County, Maryland, the planning and zoning people, when they were doing their zoning, instead of saying, well, this is where development goes in the metro core, they took a pen and outlined all the forests and say, this is where development does not go. So that's what we have to do. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. Definitely enjoyed everything you shared. I'm remembering when I was in school reading a book by the environmental historian Ellen Stroud, where she made the argument that in the last 100 years, there's been this great reforestation of the Northeast. So from 100 years ago, there was less forest, now there are more. I grew up in Washington State, and in reading that book and in discussing that book, a lot of the commentary was like, in part, the reason for the reforestation here was the fact that there was logging happening on the West Coast. And one thing I often think about is when we're conserving places, are there other places somewhere else that are being taken advantage of? And I was wondering if you knew about international networks looking at preserving forests so that we're not passing it down to the next person.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, thinking broadly. So that's what the Old Growth Forest Network, just starting there, it's interesting because, you know, we're trying to think broadly because so many small groups are trying to preserve their forests, and there was nothing happening at the national level to say, let's all talk to each other and let's help each other all preserve our forests in all these different communities. So and a lot of people say that that should be an international project, but you see I have my hands full with just this one. On international level, I would say World Resources International is doing a pretty good job of at least monitoring certain areas. So you can see if there was an accord to save a certain forest and now it's being cut. You know, a lot of that's by satellite imagery. So at least we know a little bit more about what's happening, but there is not an international organization that's looking at the whole picture and sharing it and trying to do something about it, I would say. So maybe that's a job for you. We need that, but we need that. And we need wood products and wood resources. I mean, here we are, you know, we're sitting on wooden benches tonight, and my books do have some, they have recycled content, but they do have some wood fiber in there. I mean, that's what's being recycled. So I think we can be a lot more efficient with the wood products we use, and we can say, okay, you know what, this 80% is going to be for timber, and it's going to be for products we need, but we're going to have 20% or even 10% that are not going to be touched, that are going to be reserves of biodiversity. So that's a long answer to your question, but yeah.
We think our old growth forest may take 300 or more years to come back. We see the distribution, say, in 1620. Here is probably asking your opinion or a crystal ball question. The fact is that we have brought new organisms, new flora and fauna into this country, just like we brought smallpox. We can't take it away. If we leave nature to do its balance, I heard you speaking about how the new forest would do a buffer, but eventually these new organisms are going to be integrated into old forest. Already there are some trees which are seriously threatened, perhaps forever. We want old growth forest, but how do you picture the old growth forest 3 centuries from now? Let us imagine wonderfully it looked like 1620, but still, how would it be different?
Yeah. Well, you're right, it won't be exactly the same, right? It's already changed a lot. Like, you know, we've lost the chestnuts, there's beech bark disease, there's things that are always shifting and changing. So I like to look at the really big long-term picture. You know, so in Nature's Temples, I have a chapter called The History of the Forest. The planet didn't even always have forests. Forests are something that had to evolve on this planet. The forests that evolved on this planet first, those species, we don't even have any of those species left as trees anymore. So we had these no forests, then we had these amazing forests. Then there were ice ages, those forests disappeared. Then new types of forests arose. Then forests have shifted their cover across the planet. At one point, we had no forests here during the glaciation, and then the forest we did have was like a boreal forest. And the forest in its species mix that we have now has only been here for about 6,000 years. So that's pretty short on evolutionary terms. So the forest has always shifted, and species have always moved across the earth, not with the speed they're moving now, but there's always been this change. And so in the middle of that change, there's always been evolution. The species have continued to adapt to exactly where they are and have a relationship with each other and shift each other. So that future forest, I don't know what that's going to look like, but I think there should be places where we can let that change happen, where those organisms can find their relationship to each other, where nature can do what nature does. And that's what I'm calling for. New species can evolve. You know, we tend to be heartbroken about the species we've lost, but that species wasn't always here either, like the chestnut. Who knows what's going to come next?
I understand why you want the forests in the network to be accessible, so people can appreciate them and enjoy them. But can't people also harm forests? I think if I had 1,000 acres somewhere that I wanted to preserve, I would not make my private land accessible, just because, you see initials carved in tree trunks all the time. I mean, people just going in forests can do some damage.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if I had a pristine 1,000 acres of old growth forest, I might not want to open it to the general public either. But still, I believe that it's a compromise. Because remember, we're not going to have these forests if we don't have a generation of people who care about them. So even my pristine 1,000-acre forest, I'm not going to be on this planet forever. And when I'm gone, who's going to protect that? And if there's nobody that got to see it, appreciate it, I don't know. So maybe those people that have had the ability to visit those older forests that were somewhat impacted by the other humans, maybe that'll be the community of people who care that then will see that pristine 1,000 acres and say, oh, this must be preserved. So yes, ideally we could have some places that were not impacted by humans at all on this planet to even visit. But so the Old Growth Forest Network is a compromise to both protect the forest somewhat and build that community. So I think we're at the end of our questions now, and I really appreciate your attention, and I hope you'll just keep thinking about these beautiful forests and what we can do for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the bookstore remains open, thanks to Samantha, who's making her way back there. Now we have some cookies and some coffee and tea. So you're invited to stay, talk to Joan as she signs books, converse with yourselves, among yourselves, plan where you're going to start the old growth forest in your county searching. I noticed Delaware County was not on there, so Delaware County residents, maybe you're called in this direction. We'll look forward to seeing you again on June 5 for our surprise first Monday lecture brought to you by Young Adult Friends from Continuing Revolution. Thank you.